Good morning. Welcome to the 24th session of the Questioning the Present, an online public forum devoted to discussing contemporary political and cultural issues. I am Dilip Gaonkar, the Director of Center for Global Culture and Communication here at Northwestern University, and also Director of the Center for Transcultural Studies, an intellectual network with institutional roots in the city of Chicago. And these two organizations are jointly responsible for sponsoring Questioning the Present public forum series. Today's session, 24th session of the Questioning the Present, is devoted to Professor Peter Gordon's recent book, A Precarious Happiness, Adorno and the Sources of Normativity, published in 2024 by the University of Chicago Press. We also have a panel of three distinguished scholar respondents, Professor Jacob McNulty, Professor Gordon Finlayson, and Professor Gisèle Sapiro. Let me now introduce our four panelists. Peter E. Gordon is the Amabel James Professor of History at Harvard University. He also holds faculty affiliate status in three other Harvard departments: Department of Government, Philosophy, and Germanic Languages and Literature. Primarily a scholar of modern European social theory, Peter works chiefly on themes in continental philosophy and social thought in Germany and France in late modern era, with an emphasis on critical theory, Western Marxism, Frankfurt School, Hegelianism, and related topics in phenomenology and existentialism. He has published extensively on these subjects, and his work has been duly recognized and celebrated. His very first book, Rosenzweig and Heidegger, Between Judaism and German Philosophy, published in 2003, won as many as 4 international awards. His second book, The Continental Divide, Heidegger, Cassirer, and Davos, a comprehensive philosophical reconstruction and analysis of the encounter between Heidegger and Cassirer at Davos in 1929, has been called the magisterial study by a review in New York Times Book Review, and it has received the distinguished Jacques Barzun Prize from the American Philosophical Society. His third book, Adorno and Existence, was published in 2016, followed by Migrants in the Profane, Critical Theory and the Question of Secularization in 2020. Today we are discussing Peter's recent book, Precarious Happiness, published in 2024. This book is based on Adorno lectures he delivered at the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt in June of 2019. Another volume by Peter, Walter Benjamin, The Pearl Diver, is scheduled to be published later this month by the Yale University Press. In addition, Peter has numerous co-authored and co-edited volumes. He has edited numerous collections, such as Cambridge Companion to Modern Jewish Philosophy in 2007, one too many to identify them well. So we can say currently he is working on a critical study tentatively titled Secularization and Social Theory since Max Weber. Our first respondent is Jacob McNulty. He is a historian of philosophy at Yale University, specializing in modern European philosophy. His first book, Hegel's Logic and Metaphysics, appeared in 2023 from Cambridge University Press, followed by a second on Herbert Marcuse and Frankfurt School in 2024 from Routledge. In addition to these two books, Jake has published series of articles on Rousseau, Fichte, Marx, Sartre in major scholarly journals in philosophy. He is currently working on a book on Hegel and Marx for publication by Cambridge University Press's Elements series. Aside from his scholarly preoccupation with German idealism, the Frankfurt School, and Sartrean existentialism, Jacob has an interest in musical aesthetics and published a short response piece on philosophical issues raised by atonal music. Outside of philosophy, he plays jazz guitar. Our second respondent is Gordon Finlayson, Emeritus Professor of Social and Political Philosophy at University of Sussex, where he has also served as the Director of Center for Social and Political Thought for many, many years. His areas of specialization include among others, classical German philosophy, Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, social and political philosophy, and history of philosophy. He has written extensively on Habermas, Adorno, Hegel, among others, also on Kant and Aristotle. His books include Habermas, a very short introduction published in 2005, and Habermas and Rawls Debate, published in 2019 by Columbia University Press. He has, in addition, a co-edited volume with Fabian Freienhagen called Habermas and Rawls Disputing the Political, which came out in 2010. He is currently working on two books, cultural and biographical monograph on Adorno's life and work with a co-author, Henry Pickford, and a single-authored brief conceptual historical study of the idea of immanent critique. Our final and third respondent is Gisèle Sapiro, a professor of sociology at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Science in Paris and a senior researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, that is CNRS. She is a pioneer in the field of literary sociology, combining in-depth historical studies with innovative methodological approaches. Working in the tradition of Pierre Bourdieu, she has made significant contribution to the question surrounding the connection between literature, law, and politics, and social conditions underlying the international dissemination of literary and scholarly texts. While she has published numerous monographs and books in French, only one of them, Gisèle's 2014 book, The Sociology of Literature, is available in English, published by the Stanford University Press in 2023. There's also a co-edited volume in English with Stefanos Geroulanos, The Rutledge Handbook of History and Sociology of Ideas, published in 2023, which is also in English. Currently, Gisèle is a consulting editor of the Journal of History of Ideas. In recognition of her scholarly achievement, Gisèle has received CNRS Bronze Medal and CNRS Silver Medal. In addition, she is the recipient of the Distinguished Humboldt Research Award in 2023. That is the introductions. Now we will turn to Peter Gordon for introducing his book. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, welcome. Is my voice okay? Is audio all right?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
perfect.
Very good. Well, Dilip, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I must say that the distinguished colleagues who will be commenting are, in fact, so distinguished. I might as well just stop right now to listen to the insights they want to offer. But let me just thank them in advance. Let me just say once again what Dilip already said, which is that the book we're discussing here first came out of the Adorno lectures, which I delivered in Frankfurt at the invitation of the Institute on the 50th anniversary of Adorno's death. And for the occasion, I tried to offer a fairly comprehensive philosophical portrait of Adorno, one that pulled back from specific debates to take in the full measure of his commitments. The lectures themselves, however, I should say, were rather primitive. And in writing the book, I modified and I hope improved my opinions on many points. Broadly put, the book offers a challenge to the fairly widespread view that Adorno's philosophy is best understood as a species of so-called negativism. Now, on the negativist interpretation, Adorno does not mean to furnish us with even the most minimal conception of the good or the right. We all know his well-known dictum, "Es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen." There's no right living in the false. Adorno confines himself, if we take this dictum seriously, to the purely negative practice of criticizing what is wrong with our social world, but he abjures any knowledge or experiential familiarity with the good. One of the best known and, I should say, philosophically quite impressive exponents of the negativist interpretation is Fabian Freienhagen, who laid out a strong case for it in his 2013 book, Adorno's Practical Philosophy. Now, according to Freienhagen, Adorno believes that our current social order is, quote, so deeply delusional that we cannot even conceptualize or imagine what realized humanity would consist in. That's a quote. This means that in our thoroughly bad reality, we have no claim to experiences of the good, intimations of the good, let alone anything like full-blown discursive concepts of the good. Because our social world is thoroughly false, we can claim no familiarity with what it would mean for it to be true. Now, it should be noted that this negativist interpretation bears at least a superficial resemblance to the well-known critique of Adorno that was first articulated by Jürgen Habermas in the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. As you'll recall, Habermas argued that Adorno finds himself trapped in a performative contradiction because he cannot claim normative validity for his own critical efforts. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, it may seem that Adorno and his co-author, Horkheimer, condemn reason without remainder. But this leaves them in a paradoxical position, since a totalizing critique of reason cannot claim to be rational. Habermas ends with that strong verdict. Freinhagen, however, and other negativists like him, go in an entirely different direction. He wants to say that Adorno does possess a species of normativity, though it is purely negative. The human being can reject or turn away from the bad without appealing to a positive norm of the good. Adorno can offer little more than the minimalist ethic that Freinhagen summarizes as living less wrongly. This is a doctrine that he calls meta-ethical negativism. Now, I want to emphasize that this interpretation is sophisticated and it's argued with great subtlety. Broadly speaking, however, the negativist interpretation is, of course, not original. It's a philosophically more elaborate and articulated exposition of what one might call a caricature. Among those who read Adorno, it's common to think of him as a scowling contrarian who looks down upon the world as a realm of thoroughgoing devastation. Just recall, for instance, that infamous description of the Frankfurt School by Georg Lukács, who portrayed the Institute's members as living in a grand hotel Abgrund. This general image has become so commonplace that it's hardened into a cliché. Adorno's grim phrase, "there is no right living in the false," even appears as a plaque on the external wall of the apartment building where he and his wife Gretel lived in Frankfurt's West End. And, as some of you may know, Adorno's images and aphorisms circulate as memes that one can find for sale on coffee mugs and tote bags. This is, I think, a sad fate, though perhaps an amusing one. The culture industry has exacted its final revenge on the theorist who diagnosed its pathologies. But let me say, I don't want to quarrel with caricatures or straw men. My book was initially animated by the intuition that on exegetical grounds alone, the negativist interpretation isn't entirely accurate. Throughout his published writing and in his lectures, and with some frequency, Adorno appeals to experiences of the good, of happiness, or human flourishing. He points us toward those experiences, most famously in his aesthetic theory, where he refers to successful instances of art as providing us with a promesse du bonheur, or promise of happiness. But I argue that such experiential evidence can be found everywhere in his work, from his loving description of children at play to his analysis of gift exchange, and from the simplest facts of sensual pleasure to the highest instances of happiness that he calls metaphysical experience. In one of the more evocative passages from Negative Dialectics, Adorno alludes to Hegel's deflationary view that philosophy can do no more than paint the gray of the world in gray. Adorno resists that conclusion. He wants to say, against Hegel, that even our affective despair, when confronted with modern conditions, is intelligible only if we can conceive of an alternative. Against Hegel, he writes as follows: Consciousness could not even despair over what is gray if it did not harbor the concept of a different color, whose scattered trace is not absent from the negative whole. Implicit in that statement, I think, is a guiding principle for the practice of criticism. Criticism, for Adorno, does not just reproduce the false. Criticism is possible only because we reject the false as failing our normative expectations or demands. More precisely, we can say that we find the current state of things objectionable only because we possess some rudimentary conception of how things should be different. Now, notice that Adorno does not insist that we possess unblemished concepts or norms. He's not a normative Platonist who imagines that social criticism proceeds with some experiential familiarity with, say, perfect standards of the good, as if the good were a standard preserved like a measure behind glass. He refers instead only to traces or small glimpses. Most of all, my book explores what it could mean for Adorno to practice a critique that's animated by such traces. They are admittedly incomplete or even damaged because they are disclosed under conditions of social damage. But these traces are nonetheless fragments of the good amidst the bad. They serve as experiential or material warrants for a concept of happiness. And this concept serves Adorno as a kind of postulate in virtue of which we can articulate our criticism of the world and specify in what respects it has failed our normative requirements. Such traces may be minimal, but it's an absolute prerequisite for the practice of critique that they are not wholly absent. One amusing example that some of you will know is the image of an American child whose happiness when eating an ice cream cone appears to Adorno as ein Stück Utopie, a fragment of utopia. In a more instructive example, in his Königstein lectures on criteria of the new music, Adorno argues against the widespread impression that the musical avant-garde of his time wished to present us with music that is as despairing, as ugly and distorted as the world itself. Adorno hastens to say that that impression is wrong. In the new music, he says, despair is interlaced with what he calls a precarious happiness. Now, all the same, my book is not merely an exercise in exegesis. It also seeks to justify Adorno's critical practice by exploring its philosophical presuppositions. Briefly, I claim that Adorno is engaged in a species of immanent critique. In this respect, his philosophy sustains a bond with the dialectical tradition before him. If immanent critique is possible, this is because our current world is not seamless or uniformly false. It is a broken and dynamic whole, and it is shot through with partial and anticipatory instances of the good that we can mobilize for the sake of our critical practice. Now, to say that these instances are anticipatory is to say that our critical interventions are directed toward the achievement of a world that would satisfy our demands. If we find our current reality objectionable, this already presupposes some idea of which norms it should meet and which it has failed. Adorno calls these norms emphatic concepts. He alludes, for example, to emphatic concepts of truth, the emphatic concept of art, and so forth. Now, those concepts aren't purely counterfactual. He says that we have experiential warrants that underwrite their use. Finally, those normative demands are so stringent that Adorno sees their fulfillment as nearly impossible. A world that retains even a trace of the false will not meet our demands. It will remain caught in untruth and ideology. Now, there's a nuance here, and it's one that some readers of Adorno, I think, have tended to overlook or at least diminished. And this has to do with the status of moral postulates in his work. In negative dialectics, he expressly invokes the Kantian doctrine of postulates. He finds the postulate of immortality, in fact, of special importance because it suggests that critique must be animated by a maximalist demand. No minor adjustments will suffice to satisfy our image of happiness. He quotes, for example, a memorable line from Benjamin: "So long as there is even a single beggar, there will be mythos." End quote. But it's just that demythologized utopia of a world that has been redeemed from all suffering that furnishes Adorno with the exacting postulate he requires. Because our demands are maximalist, it follows that our criticism of the current world must be ruthless and unrelenting. Anything less would imply complacency. But that's, of course, a stance of resignation that Adorno passionately rejects. Even in his darkest moments, his critical energies are animated, we could say, by the materialist correlate of the summum bonum, or highest good. And I want to end just by saying that I think we misunderstand Adorno when we imagine that his um, excoriating, um, relentless attack on social falsehood um, implies that he wants only minor adjustments, or that he has no concept of what it would be for our utopian demands to be fulfilled. It's only because the normative standard is so high that he looks around at the social landscape and at the everyday experiences of human beings and detects everywhere failures that he finds intolerable. And this explains, some of the seemingly most minor objections that he makes that may seem to us hyperbolic. For example, the famous remark about doorknobs and window closures and minima moralia and so forth. Nothing escapes this critical perspective because the standard of satisfaction would be so high. Well, that's about as brief a summary as I can provide, and I'm grateful for your attention. I'm very eager to hear the comments from my three esteemed colleagues. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And that is the shortest introduction I've had so far. So he gives us a lot of time to have a good discussion and good time for the respondent to respond. We start with our first respondent, Jacob.
All right. As we just heard, Peter rejects the received view of Adorno as a negativist who believes the social world is so thoroughly false that it gives us no normative guidance at all. I think Peter makes a persuasive case that this is a misreading and that Adorno does offer us some normative guidance. I agree with the Adorno interpretation in the book, although I'm not an Adorno scholar, and I like the view itself, especially what I'll call its combination of caution and ambition. So I think that Peter's Adorno is cautious in offering us glimpses, clues, or hints of the good life. But I also think there's serious ambition here because these are all, after all, glimpses of the good life, the source of normativity, the just society, etc. Very sought after thing in philosophy and social theory. So I have been thinking about Peter's Adorno as combining caution and ambition in an interesting way. And here I think Gordon, who you'll hear from in a minute, has a quote about seeing heaven through a glass darkly. I think that's a good illustration. I mean, on the one hand, you saw heaven. That's an amazing thing. On the other hand, you only saw it through a glass darkly, right? Your view was obstructed. You couldn't make out very much, and so on. So what I was thinking as I read the book is that there's an issue that sometimes gets raised in philosophy. It's a little silly, but it's the difference between a blurry view of a clear object and a clear view of a blurry object. Right? Those are two slightly different things, although they might come to the same thing in the end. And we can think about Adorno's view, as Peter interprets it, as having a kind of form-content distinction, right? Where it might be that what we're getting is an imperfect view of the perfect. We might be getting a perfect view of the imperfect, right? A partial good or a false or merely apparent happiness. We might be getting an imperfect view of the imperfect. That might be the most radical kind of negativism. Certainly, we're not getting a perfect view of the perfect, but it's worth having that position on the table. Maybe that's what I have when I contemplate Plato's forms, if everything goes well for me. And then we can see those views combining with different sets of tactics or strategies. And I think Peter argues, and persuasively so, that having access to the good or to normative standards is what will give us guidance and orientation. But there are other views, right? So you could imagine somebody combining one of these views with a different set of strategy or tactics. So I think of the expression optimism of the intellect, pessimism of the will, or pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? Where you don't know much, but you kind of soldier on anyway. So I'm emphasizing something. There's a kind of tension in Peter's view. It's not a contradiction, right? I mean, the view is coherent, but I think it's tricky to engage with because it has this Janus face, right? So it can show us either its modest or its ambitious face. And to the radical negativists, Peter will show the ambitious face. But then suppose we want something more worked out. We want a theory or a full-fledged account. Maybe we're Habermasian critics of Adorno, or we come from some other tradition of normative theorizing entirely, utilitarians or Rawlsians. Or we say, I'm being a little bit flippant here, but well, sentimentality about children and animals is weak tea, philosophically and politically speaking, right? I want something more. And then I think Peter will remind us of the glass darkly part. And so to me, a question we might take up is this a productive tension? You can see how there's a kind of debate that will break out where one person says, it's just a glimpse. The other person says, yes, but it's a glimpse of the good. And we go round and around in a circle. But I think there are other directions one could take the view. I also want to say that the tension between precarity and happiness or maximalism, it's not quite the same as the one I'm emphasizing here, the caution ambition issue. Another concern or another issue I wanted to raise is the difference between simplistic negativisms and more sophisticated ones. And Peter was talking earlier about the caricature versus the Frauenhagen book, or things some other Adorno scholars say. So a simplistic negativism is that he provides us with no normative guidance whatsoever. We could imagine sophisticated negativisms that he provides us with some kind of normative orientation. It's not quite knowledge. It isn't quite action guiding. It's inadequate or insufficient in some respect. And I thought it could be useful to talk about the difference between the precarious happiness view and a kind of sophisticated negativism. All right, so my first section, I say, is normative overload, question mark. So there's often one word or phrase you can say to capture an author's conception of the source of normativity. Christine Korsgaard says it's reflection. I guess Habermas thinks it's language or communicative action, Kant, reason. And Peter has a word or phrase too. This idea of precarious happiness, maybe the maximalist demand for happiness. But as I was reading this book and rereading the Adorno, I thought Adorno's normative teaching strikes me as a bit of a grab bag. And I'll mention this later, but I worked on Marcuse recently, and I find it hard not to see him as a bit of a philosophical opportunist. That is, that he'll emphasize his allegiance to different theories when the occasion requires it, but he's not exactly an adherent of any one of them. So you might get the impression from the book that there are not too few norms or principles, as in the simplistic negativist interpretation, but too many, right? So there are things to do with happiness, but happiness can be understood in different ways. There's things to do with the realization of capacities, not exactly the same thing as pleasure or happiness. There are things that sound more Kantian or Hegelian, having to do with reason or the rational society. There are things about freedom. There are things about love, things about vulnerability. So there are, different kind of watchwords that get used when we think about this source of normativity, and there are also different modes of access to it, right? There's affect, there's reason, there's theory, there's observation, there's art, there's metaphysics. And in fact, there are slightly different characterizations of what it is we're accessing. So sometimes it is the good, but sometimes it's even truth, right? That word richtig, German word richtig, can mean both, the good or the true. And sometimes it's the good, sometimes it's the good society, the rational society. And Peter doesn't say too much about theology, about negative theology. Gordon has attributed to Adorno a kind of negative theology, or is interested at least in the relationship between Adorno and negative theology. But that's obviously a sort of strand in the argument too. So it can often sometimes seem as if this source of normativity is not a single thing or type of experience, then it's a kind of web of them, and there are different modes of access. And one reason I bring that up is because in the kind of landscape of contemporary philosophy where I situate myself, you're often forced to choose between these, right? Is it pleasure or is it happiness? Is it capacities or is it feeling? Is it reason or is it something else? And then even once you've picked one of those, you choose what you think your mode of access to it is. Is it effective? Are you a sentimentalist or are you a rationalist? Or does this kind of involve a metaphysics or does, and that's what Hegel would denounce as either or thinking. And there's a lot of either or thinking in contemporary philosophy, false dichotomies, false choices, but it is still striking that all of this kind of goes together in Peter's Adorno. It's all there. It's a bit of a hodgepodge. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, actually, with being eclectic or pluralistic. But it raises a question of how systematic and how unified Adorno's position is. How do we integrate these values with one another? How do we adjudicate conflicts between them? How do we weigh them against one another? Is one or a small number of them running the show? And then you might even wonder if a position this capacious could be coherent. And I think this brings me to another issue, which is that there's not only the question of whether we have access to the good or what our mode of access is, but is it unified at all? Is there something more pluralistic, like in Berlin in Adorno or Weber talking about incommensurable value spheres? I don't know. I mean, as I say, I'm not an Adorno scholar, and but it seems to me to be a slightly different issue than how clear is our view of the thing. Is there even one thing here? Here are some thoughts I have about Adorno's eclecticism. Well, he's engaged in immanent critique, so his pluralism could stem from the plurality of values in modern societies. In consumer culture, there are certain values. In arts and entertainment, there's another set of values. In politics and business and industry, there's a third. And so he's invoking different things in different places. And I think of the beginning of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, where he says, modern moral discourse is a mess. We've inherited all these disparate frameworks. We don't know how to reconcile them. Then there's what I would call Adorno's modernism. I don't mean in the Proust-Kafka sense. I mean that he's writing very late in the history of philosophy, and he's buckling under the weight of tradition. He can't reconstruct every position from the ground up. He can't integrate every position with every other, and so he deploys them in this more, well, I don't want to say mercenary, but, well, I can't think of a better word, mercenary way. And then he might be an anti-systematic thinker, which is a view that I think used to be more common. It's not as common in the British Adornians and in Peter's book, I think. So this leads me to a kind of larger reflection, which is that I think Peter's Adorno is very much a German philosophy professor, a social theorist, and that's how he's read by British Adornians that Peter cites and engages with, and some recent critical theory. There is this other side to Adorno, which I understand is quite passé now, but it's the Adorno who is more personal and literary and eclectic, Adorno as he gets received in theory, literary studies. And one way to put pressure on the idea that Adorno is a German philosophy professor is to question whether normativity is essential to his thought, as we might be tempted to think. But I'm here raising a different issue, which is his seeming eclecticism, the fact that there are so many different types of normative views and concepts. All right, so now in this other section, and am I doing all right on time?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try to kind of blow through this. So these different kinds of normative insight. They vary in strength. It's something people always say in philosophy. It's a little bit, I don't know, barbaric as a phrase, but they vary in strength, right? Some of them they're more fleeting, personal, non-cognitive. They're glimpses of the right life. They're clues or anticipations. They're rays of light. And then there are things that are stronger, right, and more philosophically and intellectually weighty. They're scholarly even. There's a source of normativity. There's human flourishing. There's the maximization of human potential, immanent critique, ideals, and so on. And so there's a question, right, about whether the knowledge or awareness we have of these standards, is it something kind of commonplace, as some of Adorno's observations suggest, or is it something scholarly? Is it something ambitious and philosophical? Is it something for the seminar room? And I think there are elements of both in the view. But as I've said, you can imagine a kind of dialectic getting going where someone says, "You've only given us glimpses, that's not enough." And then Adorno responds, "Well, yes, but they're glimpses of the good, right? I mean, this hallowed thing." And then the critic says, "Well, then tell me what exactly it is you did glimpse, and what dispute it will help us adjudicate, or what orientation it gives us." And the Adorno kind of falls back to the idea that it was just a glimpse. It was just an intimation or something like that. And so that kind of strikes me as not a productive debate. I did wonder at times if what we have here is more of a personal stance or ethos, which again is fine, not really the makings of a philosophical research program in normative theory or a political movement. And I think another way to see this is to recognize that Adorno may have a foot in another tradition of philosophers than the Kant-Hegel one. And those are philosophical authors who are, as I put it, elusive, dissembling, interested in paradox, self-defeat, the ineffable. So Kierkegaard is a good example, Wittgenstein early and late, Nietzsche, Socrates, obviously. I do wonder if there are elements of that in Adorno, and if it's a little bit, off the beaten track of classical German philosophy and social theory. All right, so then I have this section where I ask, why not a sophisticated negativism? So the simplistic negativist says Adorno offers us no normative guidance or orientation at all. The sophisticated one, that he offers us something, but it's not sufficient. And there are some remarks that Peter cites from Timo Jutten, Gordon Finlayson, and Freinhagen, obviously, that point towards a more sophisticated negativism. These are people who think there's something there in terms of positive ideals. It's just not, we don't have knowledge of it, or it's not sufficient, or it isn't completely fleshed out, or I don't know what. So I'm thinking of this light rays metaphor, the light rays coming into the prison cell. The simplistic negativist denies them. There are none. And the sophisticated negativist, I can imagine saying a wide variety of things about them. They're there, but, right, they're only visible against a dark background, so it's only via the bad that we know the good. But the bad predominates. It's a matter of a few rays of light in a sea of darkness. But we don't have full or systematic knowledge of these light rays. The bad is known. The good is merely felt or intimated or grasped in some imperfect way. They're there, but they're fragments. They're not a whole. We don't see the entire light source or the sun or something. We have a kind of fragmentary knowledge, but the bad we know in full. These are bright beams of light, right? It's a very commanding encounter with goodness, rightness, but they aren't numerous, right? They're infrequent. And then, of course, the idea that, well, whatever they are, they don't issue determinate guidance, or even the idea that they do guide or motivate, but not cognitively or philosophically, not because they promote immanent critique or normative theorizing or anything like that. So a variety of possibilities here for our discussion. I have a final section. I've gotten into the French philosophy, French theory business. I'm very interested in Deleuze. I'm trying to write something about Deleuze's critique of Hegel, and uh, so I Deleuze sees these two traditions in modern European philosophy. One is the Hegelian, the dialectical, and the other goes from Spinoza to Nietzsche to Bergson to other. And these are all authors that Adorno knows. And more importantly, what Deleuze gets from them, right, is this very inspiring call to affirm life, reject the sad passions, experience unabated joy, even in a world that's imperfect, in a world in which there's suffering. But it's a very different tradition than the Kant Hegel tradition. It's not rationalist. It's intuitionist. It's not transcendental idealist. It's highly naturalistic. It has much more to do with romanticism, Laban's philosophy, with living life and not just reflecting on life. And because I'm reading all this stuff, I kind of wonder how much of that might have been part of Adorno's makeup. I mean, I'm not sure. I know he read and knew those authors and had some affinity for them, although he's critical. But I just wanted to get it on the table just to say that there are other ways, amor intellectualis Dei, amor fati. These are maximalist forms, demands for happiness, but they're not Habermas. They're, something else, something affective, non-cognitive. I don't know what. All right, so I'll leave it there, and I guess I did go over time, but looking forward to talking more. And thanks so much to Peter, and thanks to the organizers.
Thanks, Jake. And we are going now to our second respondent, Gordon Finlayson. You're going to use
yeah, if I may.
PowerPoint also, right? Okay.
So I'm going to keep the thanks short, but thanks. It's a wonderful invitation. And for somebody who's just left the academy, albeit perhaps briefly, and I don't do this now professionally, it's very exciting to come back in and do one of these events. So I loved reading, I loved reading Peter's book for the second time. The first time I was reading it to comment on, and I had to, that kind of stuff is sort of hard because one's concentrating a lot. But I found it very rich and suggestive, and of course, as one does, we're all philosophers. I found a lot to disagree with. But then I have a lot to disagree with in Adorno, and I find that Peter perhaps tries to be more tries to offer a kind of more sympathetic defense of Adorno than I do these days. Sorry, you want me to do my slides, don't you? That's good because I was just, hang on, share and find my, okay, here we go. So I want to go meta, if I may, just a little bit to begin with, because I think this is an important point, and talk about the difficulty of doing. I'm going to stand up. You're going to see my ceiling instead of my wall. What Peter wants to do. Peter is offering a kind of interpretation and defense of Adorno, and Adorno is very difficult to do that with because, precisely as Jacob mentioned, he is an anti-systematic thinker. Perhaps he doesn't really. I mean, he's got philosophical reasons for being anti-systematic, but also he doesn't really care for that kind of philosophizing. I think he's interested in generating insights and in following lines of thought, and he doesn't really mind if they radiate into different directions, or if he says different and discrepant things. Now, take just the example of something that he writes about a lot and ought to write about a lot because he's a critical theorist. Take the idea of criticism, of what it is and how to do it. Sometimes Adorno, I want to say, makes sweeping programmatic statements about how to do philosophy or how to do critique. like when he says, you know, in philosophical text, every proposition should be equally close to the center, right? As if it's some kind of serial composition, and he's talking about bars. But then he doesn't do that, because there are some thoughts that are just much more central to what he's doing than others, like Never Again Auschwitz, for example. That's about as central as you can get to his philosophy and critical social theory. So, and I've got a good example of. I also want to say that so his practice is varied and diverse and discrepant, and he theoretically endorses diverse and discrepant positions, and he doesn't really practice what he preaches. So he's a very difficult person to give an interpretation and defense of, because I guess, and I think Peter said this, and you get the sense that his book tries to do this, as a philosophically minded interpreter, Peter wants to give a defense of the view he's attributing to Adorno. And so he will make it as coherent as possible in order that it looks as if it's something he can endorse. Fabian does that, you know, to the nth degree, right? He's got quite a tightly consistent view of Adorno as a negative Aristotelian. And of course, he ends up then having to take liberties with a lot of the textual evidence, which is pointing in different directions. Now, here's an example, right? Here's some things that Adorno says about criticism. I'm not going to read the actual quotations. You can do that. But there are 4 positions that he gives in his text. The first is to practice immanent critique and not transcendent criticism. I'm not going to explain those terms in this talk because I've only got 12 minutes, but basically I take it you know what these are. Do immanent criticism because that's the way to do it. Criticism is always the better for being immanent, and it's the worse for being transcendent. But then he also says in Prisms, he says, well, actually, you know, neither transcendent criticism or external criticism from the outside, or immanent criticism, criticizing something from the inside, suffices, right? The alternatives, he says, cannot the alternative either calling culture into question from the outside or confronting it with the norms which itself has crystallized cannot be accepted by critical theory. So that's like neither transcendent nor immanent criticism is enough. But then he also says it makes sense to pursue these 2 perspectives together. And he says that in a slightly different text, but around the same time. In other words, here he's saying the third thing, immanent and transcendent criticism both have their place and can be fruitfully combined and practiced together, which is not quite the same as saying that neither of them suffices. And then he also says, in many cases, critique can proceed by way of confronting realities with the norms to which those realities appeal. Following the norms would already be better. So that seems to suggest that, look, in some cases, immanent criticism or internal criticism on the basis of existing norms is good enough, even though everything in this world is damaged and in some way related to the horror that's just passed. But nonetheless, you know, we can do it. There might be better ways of criticizing, but internal or immanent criticism suffices. So you can't hold all of those positions, and you can't make a theory, right, that unites them. He just says different things when he's pursuing different arguments and different. So that's why it's so difficult to do what Peter attempts to do. And I think that we have to, look at that and look at his book as an example of an interpretation and defense, which takes liberties with some of the evidence, dials down some things, dials up other aspects of Adorno. That was my kind of sideways view. I've stopped doing that a little bit. I did that a lot to begin with in my interpretation of Adorno, but now I've kind of given up that because it's too challenging and too difficult. I have a slightly different approach. So Peter mentions in his book that I changed my mind on Adorno because I I started off saying, look, he is this austere negativist who thinks that we can have virtually no conception of or access to the good or the right, which I do think Adorno thinks. But then I started saying, no, well, actually, he's a much less austere negativist. He's a partial negativist. We have some kind of aspect to the good or the right. Because Adorno also says that. So I did change my mind, but then I took a different view, which is no, Adorno says both things. They're naturally not compatible. So my approach to him now tries to take that kind of aspect of Adorno's overall approach to philosophy. Right. Now, there is a working idea in Peter's account of Adorno that I share. Definitely, I share. It's about what it is to criticize something. To criticize something as bad. I mean, criticism doesn't in principle have to be bad, but generally speaking, to criticize something is to make a negative evaluative judgment of it. I've got a sort of definition of what criticism is here. It's not a definition in a technical sense. It tries to capture what I think critique or criticism has been kind of portrayed as since about the 18th century, when it first became kind of a current concept. But the thought that I agree with, that is fundamental to Peter's approach, is that if one makes an apt criticism of something bad or deficient or flawed or evil, then one does so in the light of some good or something better. And I want to be a bit more specific about that, because this characterization of or definition of criticism that I give is that criticism is a rational, justified, discerning, usually negative, evaluative judgment of an appropriate object of criticism in the light of an appropriate standard. I'm pretty convinced that if you make a criticism, what makes a standard appropriate is that the standard will, in some sense, be, if one makes a criticism of something bad and the criticism is an apt criticism or a correct criticism, then the standard will be something better or best or something good. So criticism will, a critical judgment will appeal at some level at something better or good in the light of which the criticism is made. So I don't think it makes any sense to say, no, you can just criticize the bad in the light of the bad and have no access whatever, or the standard will have no recourse whatever to something good or better. I don't want, however, to make that into a kind of polar notion. It might be scalar, whatever it is. But I do think that that's the idea that Peter has and that I share. Whether Adorno has that view, I don't actually know. Sometimes he operates in a way that makes you think he does have that view, but when he actually writes about criticism, he has a far more sophisticated view, which often, like the sentence that Peter just quoted about Bewusstsein könnte gar nicht über das Grau verzweifeln, hegte es nicht an versprengten Spur einer verschiedenen Farbe, or something like that. So consciousness couldn't despair over the grey unless it had within it a notion of a different colour, which was was present in the negative whole. That seems to me probably an allusion to Goethe's Farbenlehre, probably nicked from Walter Benjamin, who was obsessed with that. It's another story, but Goethe wrongly thought that colour came out of a mix of darkness and light. He didn't dream of the fact that white light, in fact, was a mixture. And Adorno obviously tries sometimes to to give a kind of philosophical account of that metaphor. It's slightly different from the more simple one that I've just offered you, which is just if you criticize something as bad, you do it in the light of something better or good or best. Yeah, the two kinds of negativism. I actually am responsible for this terrible nomenclature, austere negativism and partial negativism. I apologize. The reason I called it austere negativism, not complete negativism, was because, as Peter says, Adorno rejects nihilism, and he rejects the idea of despair. He doesn't think that, even, think about the motto from the second section of Minima Moralia. When everything is bad, it must be good to know the worst, that he takes from Bradley. However, austere negativism nonetheless is the idea that we have almost no access to the good and the right, and that standards of goodness and rightness that could orient our actions are not available to us, at least not easily available. And then I contrasted that with a laxer view, right? A partial negativism, which is just that we have some limited access to the good or right, albeit in a partial or fragmented form. And I used to think that, like Peter, that if and insofar as Adorno was a partial negativist, this problem that he wasn't interested in, but that Habermas kind of brought up, and that a lot of philosophers in Germany and the States have been interested in, what are the normative grounds of Adorno's critical theory, wasn't really a problem. I've slightly modulated my view on that as well now. Anyway, I want to just quickly hone in on Peter's central argument as I see it. How am I doing for time, by the way? Am I doing okay? Or am I nearly over? Dilip? Or somebody?
You have another 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I can say something in 5 minutes, definitely. So Peter rejects the austere negativist view. He objects that Adorno was one, and that means denying that the World War II social world was pervasively and enduringly evil, and Adorno thought it was. And then he says, well, if he wasn't an austere negativist, Adorno must have really been a partial negativist, and he offers some evidence for that. And then he concludes that so long as Adorno is a partial negativist, the way is clear for him to endorse the approach of immanent criticism. That's a very simple overview of Peter's argument. And what do I want to say about it? Well, one thing I want to say about it is it's interesting that to resolve what we might call the normative problem in Adorno, which is that on the one hand, Adorno, his criticisms of society clearly have a negative and sort of indelibly moral valence. At the same time, Adorno seems to abjure both the ethics and morality first kind of criticism and the very basis on which such criticism could be made. And that does raise a difficult question about in how then does he justify the conclusions that have this indelibly moral timbre. So what I want to say that if Peter is right, and that the interpretation of Adorno as a partial negativist is correct, then all he really needs to show that Adorno has resolved or addressed the normative problem is that, look, there's some available normative or evaluative standards taken from these available fragments of the good life, or of a precarious good life, of a precarious happiness. And he need say nothing at all about immanent criticism, right? He just says he can make justified ethical criticisms of his own society. Now, I actually think that bringing an immanent critique here just makes it much more difficult for him, because immanent criticism, whilst it looks really straightforward, is much less straightforward than it looks. Many Marxist critical theorists have presented immanent critique as if it's a kind of single way of doing criticism or single method that somehow brings to light contradictions and is opposed to or different in kind from any kind of normative or evaluative criticism. I mean, I don't think that, and I don't know whether Peter does, but a lot of Marxists do. And the question to them is, okay, then, well, if you are going to make normative conclusions or normative judgments about your own society or about capitalist society, on what basis will you make them? And that's a problem within Marxism that is well known. Okay, I'm not going to say anything more about that. That was about the normative problem. Okay, so let me just bring up an interpretive problem that Peter now has to deal with, I think. And the one is that there's a lot of evidence from Adorno's major published work that he does endorse something like austere negativism. And all these famous quotations, you know, they're very hard to reconcile with partial negativism, and they seem strongly to suggest austere negativism. There is nothing innocuous left, things like that. The whole is the untrue, the no right living thesis. And some actually much more clearer, well worked out views. On the other hand, the evidence that he's a partial negativist and that he thinks, although he might write about, you know, in his aesthetics and various other moments about things in life that don't seem to be that bad and that contaminated with, you know, the if you like, the moral catastrophe of Auschwitz, it's very hard to find passages where he says, we can make reliable normative criticisms of our society, because he's not interested in that problem. He's not interested in that. So I think the evidence for partial negativism is just much more slender. I mean, I can remember off the top of my head that he says, yes, of lilacs and nightingales, by their very existence, where the universal net has permitted them to survive, it makes us believe that life is still alive. So that's an example which looks like it contradicts the thesis of minima moralia, that life is not alive, that life does not live. So anyway, I think that in a way that what that means is that the departing interpretive assumption behind Fabian's book, I think, is more well motivated by the evidence than the interpretation of Adorno offered by Peter, even though I think Peter is arguing for a more attractive position, and that Fabian ends up in a position that is very unattractive as a defense of as a position, in order that he can, if you like, make Adorno come out as the, you know, being an a kind of an austere negativist, a meta-ethical negativist, as he calls it, and having a position that Fabian thinks he can defend. There are three considerations that I know that Peter adduces in favor of his interpretation. And there's his discussion of philosophy as exaggeration. And with that, I'm just going to say, yeah, that makes things complicated. But I'm not so sure it licenses him to conclude that Adorno is a partial negativist. Because, for one reason, Adorno is not consistent about even his hyperbole. Some of them seem to me to be meant literally, because he thought he lived in extreme circumstances. And of course, he did live in very extreme circumstances. And some of them don't. Some of them seem to be jokes. Secondly, Adorno hints at some kind of hidden relation between non-identity, bodily feelings, and what he calls the somatic moment, and the good. And what I have to say about that is that Adorno does, but he shouldn't. The way I think about non-identity is that to think is to identify, to conceive is itself to identify, and therefore to try and think or grasp the ineffable or the inconceivable is a deliberately self-stultifying effort. I think of Ramsay's quip, what cannot be said, and it cannot be whistled either. So I don't think even though Adorno thinks there's some kind of relation between non-identity and the good, that is going to help him solve the problem that I say Adorno's not interested, but we as philosophers are on his behalf. I was going to say something about Adorno's maximalist account of human flourishing and Aristotle, but I think I shall leave that. I'm not convinced about that. I think that in a way, Peter takes the very opposite view of Fabian, trying to kind of align Adorno's discussion of the good life with Aristotle, but I think that's a very hard thing to do. To me, if he's anything, Adorno is a kind of sensualist, and his idea of happiness. Remember that, like Plato, Aristotle is incredibly priggish about the good life, and so the life of pleasure is not a candidate for the good life. He thinks it's basically bestial and unworthy. And what happened there? But Adorno actually does think of happiness as kind of bestial. He actually, in one of his expressions, he says, "Rien faire comme une bête." Doing nothing like an animal would be one kind of happiness. And another one is the idea of sexual union, strangely enough, which he calls a blessed straining in Minima Moralia. And that's very hard to reconcile with a slightly more high-minded view that Aristotle has of the good life as a kind of virtuous life. So, there's things to say against that, but I'm just saying that, my conclusion here is that I like elements of Peter's view, but I just think he has his work cut out, right, to support it, while maintaining that here's the evidence that Adorno gives that he holds this view, and it's a view that can be independently supported and made internally coherent and defended by more contemporary philosophical canons. That's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. And we are going to now move quickly to Gisèle, the final third respondent. Here we are going, Gisèle.
Yes, many thanks to Peter and Dilip for inviting me to this discussion to discuss this impressive book by Peter. I must say that I'm not a specialist of Adorno nor of the Frankfurt School, and although I was trained in philosophy, I'm first and foremost sociologist and literary scholar. So it's an honor for me, and as well as a pleasure, to take part in this panel. I must also first emphasize that although not a specialist, I tremendously enjoyed reading this book, which is very clear in its argument, extremely sharp and pleasantly fluent in style at the same time. It was a true intellectual pleasure, a notion that is relevant to our topic. So to commence once again the argument, and I will take the coherent version that Peter proposes of Adorno. So Peter challenges here the common reading of Adorno as a negativist and seeks for sources of normativity in his work, which he finds in the notion of human flourishing or happiness. Key to his argument is the notion of the non-identical, whose function in Adorno's philosophy Peter compares to Kant's thing in itself as a way to avoid solipsism. In Adorno, the non-identical is what epistemologically allows for an immanentist criticism. This is what enables to, quote, dispel the illusion of social necessity and draws attention to unrealized possibilities. Peter further draws on Rachel Yegi's illuminating distinction between immanent criticism and internal criticism, while the latter refers to critique based on the existing norms, which leads to a reformism that might confirm and reinforce the dominant ideology. Immanent criticism is potentially transformative. Human flourishing is the normative ideal that in Adorno orients transformative immanent criticism, and Peter sets it in contrast with human suffering, which, according to Adorno, needs to be recognized and expressed. So contrary to it's been said, Freienhagen, Peter doesn't think that Adorno's conception of human flourishing is merely negative. He illustrates that through examples such as the practice of the gift that cannot be reduced to mere exchange, like in Hautes, in spite of the logic of commodity fetishism as defined by Marx, a logic which tends to marginalize the selfless act of giving. The same idea applies to Adorno's aesthetic theory. Art cannot be reduced to fetishism of commodities despite the growing hold of the market on artworks. According to Peter, Adorno's aesthetic theory is one of the best instantiations of Adorno's conception of immanentist criticism and also a major source for his concept of human flourishing, as artworks carry the emancipatory hopes that sustain transformative criticism. I very much appreciated the way Peter contextualizes Adorno's aesthetic theory in chapter 5 in light of the decline of modern art and the rise of pop art on one hand, and of the Marxist debates on art on the other, especially his confrontation with Walter Benjamin's thesis. Key to these debates is the notion of autonomy, which in Adorno is located in form. But far from pure formalism, Adorno points to the dual nature of artworks as autonomous structures and social phenomena, which makes it resemble a monad. The social content undergoes an alchemical transformation through its formal elaboration. And for him, an artwork is successful when, quote, the unresolved antagonisms of reality return in them as immanent problems of form. It has to be both autonomous and responsive to word suffering. In the truthful portrait of our unreconciled condition, as Peter puts it, lies the critical power of art. So Peter confronts Adorno's notion of autonomy with Benjamin's analysis of the aura and the mechanical reproduction of artworks, which dissolves its exclusive appropriation by the bourgeoisie into mass consumption. This reminded me of a very interesting practical confrontation of Aragon, the writer, with representatives of the Communist Party in 1949 at the height of Jdanovism. The representatives considered that his novel Les Communistes was too bourgeois, and Aragon answered by contesting the authority of the working class to judge his work, arguing that writing is a profession, and he demanded to be assessed in light of the history of the French novel. So the tension between autonomy and heteronomy embodied by the Adorno-Benjamin debate was reflected in the cultural practices within the Communist Party and the cultural tensions. At the theoretical level, Adorno's position is much closer to Bourdieu's field theory than Benjamin's approach. Bourdieu theorized autonomy of cultural practices through the opposition between field of small-scale production as opposed to the field of large-scale production, and for him as well, form is what prevails at the pole of small-scale production. Bourdieu thus transposed the opposition autonomy-heteronomy to the functioning of the literary field in order to understand, and other art fields, how specific norms and self-referentiality to the field's history determine the literary practices or the art practices at its autonomous pole, by contrast with the large-scale production oriented towards social demand. This was just a remark, but Bourdieu helps understand sociologically and historically the conditions of possibility of cultural relative autonomy as well as the challenges it faces, especially in the present days. Regarding the autonomy of the artwork itself, I wanted to ask Peter if he considered Adorno's exchanges with Lucien Goldman, who drew a lot from Adorno, but Adorno seems also to in turn have borrowed from Goldman the idea of sinnvollen dynamischen Strukturen, meaningful dynamic structures, which articulates form and content and allows to escape the alternative between art for art's sake and engaged literature. Peter sees Adorno's interpretation of the scherzo of the third movement of Mahler's Third Symphony as illustrative of the homology between musical and social form. And this notion of homology would perhaps need more elaboration, although I know it's not Peter's focus, but I would like to reintroduce, and maybe it points to the discussion among Marxists pointed to by Gordon, to reintroduce in this regard the concept of shattered mirror and Weltanschauung worldview. How do they help think of the relationship of art and the social world as not mere reflection, as in classical Marxist theory? How do they combine with the concept of form and homology? For instance, in his essay on Endgame, Adorno contrasts Beckett's play with Sartre's existentialist plays, which illustrates, he says, a worldview through rather classical theatrical means, while in Beckett, the negation of signification also leads to the destruction of the theatrical form. And by the way, he also attacks Lukács as totalitarian for rejecting Beckett. So the struggles within the Marxist thinkers of aesthetics are not only theoretical, they also disagree on the canon itself. So regarding Benjamin's theory, I must say it's marginal, but less convinced of Peter's suggestion to see in Adorno's constant attempts to challenge him as an expression of survivor's guilt. Maybe there is part of that, but as Peter demonstrates, this confrontation started long before the war, and I would rather speak of a field effect, Adorno positioning himself in discussion and contrast to the most valuable thinker in his eyes of, and this is a classical strategy of self-positioning in the field. But this strategy is also deeply rooted in Adorno's own beliefs, his aesthetic dispositions, his habitus. Being attached to modernism, especially in music, the second Viennese school, Schoenberg and Weber, and also in literature, Kafka and Beckett, Adorno has indeed been seen in the 70s as a representative of bourgeois elitist taste, especially in light of his criticism of mass culture and of jazz. And Peter's charitable reading of Adorno tries to save him from this criticism, but also shows how Adorno is not consistent with himself in his criticism of jazz. According to Adorno, every artwork carries a mix of exchange value, which entails its commodification, and of a use value that resists this process, or at least cannot be reduced to it, even though the principle of exchange value tends to destroy use values. As Peter points out, it's not a typology of artworks according to these two principles, but a matter of relative share of each in every artwork. However, in his analysis of jazz, Adorno applies a purely typological classification. It is important to emphasize that Peter partly explains Adorno's judgment in light of the kind of jazz music he was exposed to, mainly big band orchestras, which were located more at the commercial pole of the subfield of jazz, to use Bourdieu's theory. But Peter doesn't mention this as an excuse. Using Bourdieu's theory, I would also suggest that Adorno was theorizing his own aesthetic dispositions and education without thinking of their conditions of production. I must confess on a personal note that my own inherited and acquired aesthetic habitus feels very close to Adorno's, except perhaps for his judgment on jazz, while my professional habitus as a sociologist makes me, of course, understand the critiques against him, and it is a contradiction that is not easy to overcome, although it can be directly productive. I suspect Bourdieu experienced the same dilemma, which he partly resolved in distinguishing the use of the exchange value of art for distinction purposes by the dominant fractions of the dominant class, the high bourgeoisie, versus the Kantian aesthetic experience, which he located at the dominant within the dominated fractions of the dominant class, endowed with more cultural capital than economic and political capital. I think it's only a partial solution. It's a beginning of a solution. Within the Marxist subfield, Adorno's aesthetic theory should also be situated with regards to the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, especially Raymond William and Richard Hogarth, who were trying to envision popular culture as distinct from mass culture and to emphasize the way through which the working class distances itself from this mass production rather than identifying with it. This questioning was opening to a sociology of reception. They were not philosophers, but literary scholars who tried to open literary studies to non-canonical culture and to dignify popular practices instead of reducing them to pure mystification. Adorno's rejection of popular culture does not lessen his major contribution to aesthetic theory and to the analysis of modern literature and music, and Peter's contribution brilliantly demonstrates that it cannot be understood as pure negativity of the social world, nor can autonomous art be entirely extracted from the word, and its promesse de bonheur does not lie in pure aesthetic pleasure, but in its critical and thus transformative power. Finally, I thought very important that Peter specifies in the conclusion that the anti-foundationalist ethics of vulnerability that he attributes to Adorno is not a purely individualistic virtue ethics, but is deeply political and social, even though the research about the authoritarian personality raises questions about the complex dialectic between the individual and the state in the advent of fascism, an issue that is extremely topical nowadays. A very last marginal remark about Foucault, which has to do with this. I'm not a specialist of Foucault either. I know him a little better than Adorno, but I'm not convinced of Peter's argument about Foucault's entire negation of the subject. Maybe Foucault was convinced we need to first change the institutions. Foucault's political engagements, for instance, against the carceral regime, attest to his belief in the possibility to change the social order, and he did contribute to it. And although he was not a Marxist, it was, in the case of the prison, his social practice of combating the carceral system which led him to theorize his social critique. So thanks again for giving me this wonderful opportunity to discuss the remarkable book by Peter.
Thanks, Gisèle. Okay, Peter, you have a lot on your plate. You have 3 people to respond to, and coming from different angles.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much to all 3 of you, Gisèle, Jake, and Gordon. These are wonderfully rich remarks, and I'd love to leave some time for others who are following along here to ask questions as well. So I'll try to keep my remarks brief. I do want to mention that all 3 of the commentators have taught me a great deal. I should mention, first of all, that Gordon, as he alluded to very quickly in passing, read the entire manuscript for me. And it was some of the most searching, scrupulous, involved reading that one could ever hope for as a scholar. So Gordon, thank you for that. I mean, the book still has many, many flaws, but less thanks to you. Jake and Gisèle, these are extraordinarily helpful. There's too much to respond to here, but I'm going to begin with a methodological point that Gordon mentions, which is the difficulty of writing a book which is at once an interpretation of a thinker, what that thinker happened to believe, and a defense of that thinker, trying to offer independent philosophical defenses of what that thinker happened to believe. In doing work in the history of philosophy, when we often do work that's devoted to the reconstruction of one thinker's written corpus, these 2 tasks are often run together. And running them together does create some problems, as Gordon pointed out. Sometimes it's simply the case that the philosopher we're trying to, whose ideas we're trying to reconstruct, um, has some bad views. Trying to offer a philosophical offense can put us in an extraordinarily unpleasant situation of trying to defend views that might not be defensible. The other problem, and Gordon mentioned this as well, is that sometimes the philosopher has various views, not all of which are self-consistent. I actually think in the case of Adorno, that's probably right. I think it's fair to say that Adorno was um, uh, rather asystematic, uh, willfully or proudly asystematic at times, and therefore the attempt to impose upon him one philosophical interpretation that is consistent all the way through can seem to be against the spirit of his own writing. We know that he took a fair bit of inspiration from Nietzsche. We know how much he was inspired by Kierkegaard as well. Um, and those two exemplars simply drive home the point that we're confronting a thinker here whose own stylistic brilliance and love of aphorism and love of hyperbole often led him to experiment with positions which are indeed something like uh, thought experiments rather than settled philosophical claims, all of which add up to one stable, philosophically defensible view that we could call Adorno's philosophy. So that's a serious challenge. And I have to say that I came away from this book with the feeling that I'm not certain I want to write books of that kind anymore. Um, trying to feel oneself beholden to a canonical thinker simply because that thinker wrote certain things puts you in a really unpleasant position of trying to defend someone with whom you might disagree. And I actually found myself disagreeing with Adorno. Now, one of the points on which I have decided I disagree most of all with Adorno came up at the very end of my book, and it has to do with something that Jake, you mentioned at the end of your comments. At the end of your comments, Jake, you said, "Are we really coping here with a philosopher who was trying to thematize his own personal stance as a kind of personal ethos? That it's a first-person experiential argument." Now, that goes along, I think, with some of the things that Gisèle said um, as to Adorno's attempt to um, really convey his own aesthetic sensibility, his own moral sensibility, his own intellectual experiences, as if they were themselves self-credentializing. That is, as if Adorno could present them to us with sufficient force um, that we would find ourselves in agreement with him. The unfortunate thing about that method of arguing is that I don't think first person reports on experience, however many instances of say partial happiness or experiences of the partial or damaged good, however many of those may appear, they're not self-credentializing. Um, they're candidates for our own reflection, but I think they require further justification and some kind of intersubjective norms by which we could decide are these are these valid instances of the good? Are these experiences that we all share? Or might it be the case, as is surely the case, that some people, when they listen to Schoenberg or Berg, simply think it's terrible? And can we really say that Adorno's simply wrong, or that this is such good music? When some people might disagree. I happen to like Schoenberg and Berg, so I don't have that problem. But I wanted to raise it as a more general problem that it does seem as if he uses his own first personal experiences as if they don't require further argument. And I don't like that. And I came away from the book thinking that this is why Adorno's appeals to experience are not satisfactory if they are supposed to serve as, let's say, incorrigible, ultimately justified instances of the good. That's why I suggested at the end, and some of my readers were very unhappy with me for this, that we need second generation Frankfurt School theories of justification and validation to go along with first person critical theory allusions to experience. So those are two very general points. Um, One point I wish to make more or less in passing has to do with Gisèle's reference to Adorno's rejection of mass culture. Although I don't say anything about it in the book, I think it's probably worth saying here that I think that um, the extraordinarily strong verdicts for which Adorno is best known are not necessarily representative of his more nuanced positions. And if we read his Currents of Music or his Introduction to the Sociology of Music, we find that there he has things to say about, say, leichte Musik that are far more favorable. And I gave a talk once in Rome about um, a lovely jazz standard that Adorno really liked. It happens to have the amusing title, in case you don't know this jazz standard, the amusing title Deep Purple. Now, those of you who are my age will know from the 1970s that there was a heavy metal band called Deep Purple, and they took their name from that jazz standard. But the jazz standard is a piece that was well known at the time. It's very close in its melodic structure and belonged to the same moment as oh dear, I'm forgetting the other piece at the moment, but I'll remember it. In any case, Adorno liked it a great deal. He liked this jazz standard a great deal. Some of you may know it because Sarah Vaughan recorded it, and it's a lovely recording. Um, and that tells us something interesting, which is that Adorno was at times, seldom, but at times capable of offering favorable remarks on forms of commodified jazz. And I think we should keep that in mind. Those sorts of occasional, more nuanced claims stand in contrast to the extremely harsh verdicts that he offered, for example, in his essays on jazz. Um, but that's just a remark in passing. Um, a One more remark that I want to make um, before I hear from others, I'd really like to hear from others, is the what Jacob calls the Janus-faced character of Adorno's work, and I think that's a lovely way of putting the problem. Um, all of us, when reading Adorno, are confronted with a thinker who seems to have um, entertained various thoughts in various places that don't necessarily add up to one self-consistent view. And as Jake points out, one of the results is that even in my book, we have um, we have two different claims that both deploy a metaphor of light. We find quite frequently in Adorno's work a metaphor of light when he's referring to glimpses of the good. Um, these are, uh, for example, bits of light that show up in the prison in Beethoven's Fidelio, and he has remarks on that. But we also have the notion that um, these are that this is a very dim light, and perhaps we're seeing these instances of the good under conditions of distortion. So we have two different views here, and I think, Jake, I think you're entirely right to say that depending on what my particular target is in the book, I will at one point emphasize that these are glimpses of the good, and at other moments I will emphasize that these are merely glimpses of the good. And I think that's right. What I think I want to emphasize is a more general point, that regardless of which face of Janus we take, Adorno's position can't be satisfactorily described as one of thoroughgoing negativism where suffering alone gives us the evidence we need for turning away from it. Now, I've written about this elsewhere, and it's a paper I've been developing on the problem of suffering and how that relates to Adorno's negativism. There's a view out there that I think has become very popular these days. You can find it, for example, in exponents of Afro-pessimism as well, that there's something objectionable in any political philosophy that invokes even the slightest conception that the world could be better than it is. And that view is supposed to be a kind of tough-minded recognition that the world is just simply gone to hell. And that if you don't think the world has wholly gone to hell, you're guilty of a kind of, let's say, bourgeois reformism or a naivete. And at its worst, what it does to a critic like me is it puts you in a very uncomfortable position on your back foot where you're trying to say something like, oh, come on, the world isn't as bad as all that. Now, of course, as a political philosopher, particularly given the egregious suffering that we see in our world, no one wants to find themselves in that position. So it's rhetorically a very interesting position that's developed out there in political philosophy. And I don't know what to say about it. What I really want to say is, well, then why are you objecting? If you really think the world is just, Dante's Inferno, to take William Clare Robinson's comparison between Marx and Dante very seriously, well, then I want to know, why do you object? After all, the entire world is simply structured this way. This is the universe we live in. There's no alternative. But, there's no alternative is a conservative line. And I don't even think Adorno has that kind of position. It is true, and I'll end with this point, that in negative dialectics, Adorno at one moment quotes, slightly misquotes, but misquotes from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. And the line is, Weh spricht vergeh. Suffering says, be gone. Now, the thought there, if you're a thoroughgoing negativist, is that you don't need anything beside the fact of suffering to turn us away from suffering. Suffering is already a protest against the world that caused it. I think that's a very, very interesting view, but of course, it actually doesn't follow. It can't follow because, for example, there are forms of suffering that we think are perhaps right. If a wealthy man is charged with a strongly progressive income tax, he may feel he has suffered because of the loss of income. Well, we would say, well, that's just the way it has to be because there's a larger norm of distributive justice which puts your suffering in the proper context. What that means, of course, is that suffering is not self-credentializing. It doesn't furnish us the normative requirements we need to reject it. It depends on a larger normative framework, a framework of, be it justice, be it a notion of human flourishing, that tells us which suffering should be rejected and which one should actually be accepted as the right way to go. Now, I'll end with one final comment on our current situation. And it prompted me to write something recently about this. Adorno, as many of you know, at the end of Negative Dialectics, revises or comes up with what he calls the new categorical imperative, which is that we should arrange our thoughts and our conduct so that nothing like Auschwitz ever happens again. Shortened shortened to the familiar formula that's around us today, we have the idea of never again. I think Adorno really did subscribe to that formula. And one of the things that I find welcome in his work is that he was willing to deny the singularity or incomparability of the Holocaust, and therefore opened up that phrase to a wider deployment when confronted with all varieties of mass atrocity and genocide. I'll just end with that point. And thank you so much, all three of you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for an excellent response. And now I think we have about 10 plus minutes and we want to open it up. I think instead of going back to the respondents. Vidura, do you have questions, people?
No, Dilip, I don't have any. No one's kind of reached out in the chat. So if people have questions, please use the, raise hand function in the reactions and ask your questions. We'll just call on you one by one.
Okay, if nobody is coming up with a question, let me ask a question then. In fact, I was thinking in terms of when, Jake's notion about Janus faced, during that point, I remember the way Jake argued is there are so many sort of a fragmentary glimpses of the good, and that Adorno sort of articulates or identifies, and then also in different kind of a linguistic genre, aphorism in which he articulates it. And that, Jake was saying in somehow contradicts what Peter had said, that whatever glimpses of the good, fragmentary, scattered, that Adorno might identify and articulate, they were all done from the standpoint of maximalist conception of the good. Maximalist. So I was wondering whether they are actually not so much contradictory as actually interrelated to each other. It is precisely because Adorno had such a maximalist conception of good, and to which he sort of adhered to relentlessly, that you were able to identify various kind of glimpses and still acknowledge and appreciate it. Might it not one read it that way, rather than saying those sort of don't harmonize together? Yeah, that is the question. So let's at least see whether we can get something going. Jake, you can answer.
May I say something very quickly? This is one of the themes in Peter's book that most interests me. And I think a good place to start is with the thought that there are different ways of maximizing. There's utilitarianism, the philosophic calculus, that's a kind of calculative way of maximizing. But then there's something like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. I affirm the way I live so much, I want it forevermore, infinitely. Very different experience, more kind of affective and mystical. So could be interesting to think about what exactly is the maximizing here? I mean, is it what Bernard Williams calls government house utilitarianism, where maximizing quantitatively and as a social planner, or is it like the maximalization of, my moment of happiness feels infinite sort of thing, which we know from other traditions. It's not, yeah.
That is an interesting question. I think Peter might be able to tell us.
Well, I think we're confronted here with a moment in Adorno's writing that starkly contradicts my interpretation, and I don't want to ignore it. I actually want to face it directdirectly. As some of you will know, there's a moment in Minima Moralia, and I believe it's in Gordon, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's in the same aphorism where he says, rien faire comme une bête. And it has to do with Adorno's thought that we shouldn't be trying to maximize human potential, that human happiness does not involve mining all of the resources or potentials within the human being so that we flourish with all of our excellences fully realized. Gordon, am I right that that's the passage? I think it is.
A critique of productivism in Sur l'eau. Yeah, there is.
Yes,
yeah.
right,
And that's
right.
the context in which he brings up Gaonkar and Bet.
Very good. Yes, yes. So it's in Sur l'eau, and it's that passage. And I think that this is one of the most interesting challenges to what I've argued. Because on my view, Adorno has to have an exacting, highly demanding standard of what our social arrangements should be, such that he can find almost everything failing that standard. But that standard seems to involve something like the full flourishing of humanity. In his lectures on dialectics, he refers to the emphatic concept of the human being. And he seems to have in mind some concept of what human beings should be that has never been perfectly instantiated, because all human beings are deeply flawed in some way, and the social structure is arranged in a particular way that prevents human beings from flourishing as he imagines they should. So on the one hand, he has this notion of the emphatic concept of the human being. And then on the other hand, in Sur l'eau, he has this argument against the idea that there's an ideal of the fully realized human. Now, I'm not going to try to resolve that. This is where I sort of wash my hands of the whole thing and say, I can't make Adorno entirely cohere. And maybe that's fine. But I do think that this is a very interesting problem for anybody who wants to say that Adorno has a conception, even a glimpse of what it would be like for our life to be fulfilled, even though he speaks that way. Yeah. Okay.
We have a question from Joe Luna. Joe, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, I must dash after this. I'm so sorry. I'm in the middle of cooking dinner, but I just was very very grateful for the talk and the responses, and it was lovely to hear you talk, Peter. I've hugely enjoyed your book on Adorno and Kierkegaard as well. So thank you for that. I've really just a passing comment about the whole sort of the core substance of the talk, and from what it sounds like the book, it struck me that perhaps the first critic of what has later become negativism was Siegfried Kracauer, when in 1960, I'm just reading from the letters, they had a conversation. I think they were on a holiday together in the Alps or something. And as you do when you're on a holiday with your friends, you used to have long, drawn-out arguments about dialectics in the evening. And in Krakauer's notes, he wrote down, I told him, you curse the bürgerliche Gesellschaft, reject communism, frown down on the social democracy, etc. What do you suggest should be done in terms of social changes, other institutions? His brackets, pitiable answer was, I know and say what is bad. Is this not enough? In sum, all that exists only to be devoured in the dialectic process, which Teddy keeps going on and on because of his lack of substance of vision. And I just was reminded of that by the talk, and wondered, Peter, if that early proto-negativism appeared in your book. But also, I've always loved imagining the idea that Teddy's response to this, is this not enough, came with a wry smile, and perhaps a twinkle in the eye, and perhaps a sense that the pressure, which is a really important word, obviously, for Adorno when it comes to happiness, straining, pressure, intensity, that he had filled his dear friend with this incandescent fury that he wasn't going to provide any answers, that pressure itself is indissociable from any emphatic concept of happiness. A very stray thought, but mostly just gratitude for the talk. And yeah.
Thank you, Joe. That's a fascinating thought. I mean, I don't have much to say about it. I didn't include that exchange in my book. Well, I don't actually have more to comment on it. Maybe there's one last question. I don't know if we have time.
Any more questions?
Nobody else has raised their hand or any group, so we're also almost at time. Oh,
I can ask a
Okay.
question.
please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm interested in your book, whether you think that love is an instance of like the intensification of precarity, or like an instance of a glimpse of happiness, or if it's something in between. I'm using Adorno, and he has many. He seems to have like varied views. Like in the same way in aesthetics, he talks about authentic artworks as like escaping commodity fetishism. And those who are not non-authentic or like cultural industry artworks as like responding to that. He seems to have also ambivalent views on love. Like sometimes in Minima Moralia, he has some reflections where he idealizes it, and then he distances himself from like Hegel's idea that like love is reconciliation through bourgeois marriage. And he also has a very interesting essay responding to Kierkegaard's philosophy of love. So I guess like I was curious to see like where do you think Adorno stands? Because I think it's one of those instances where you don't really know what he thinks. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I mean, so one interesting thing that we find in Adorno, and it was undeveloped in the book, but it's there, is Adorno's notion that there's a correct kind of posture which he hopes human beings could adopt, which is a posture of responsiveness or receptivity to the world. And he relates that to what he calls love toward things. It's a very interesting notion. It's a kind of openness that he thinks the bourgeois subject has failed to cultivate. Bourgeois coldness has closed us down from sensual experience and from our sensual relation to others. His notion of responsiveness, or what I call in the book his ethics of vulnerability, relates to that. And one of the people in critical theory who's tried to develop this idea is Hartmut Rosa, whose notion of resonance is very close to what Adorno says. And Hartmut even cites Adorno on this idea. Well, let's see. That's just one point I would make about this. The more general point is it seems to go along with Adorno's very conception of what it is to be a subject in relation to an object. The subject should not dominate the object, but the subject needs to be in some relation to the object. And when Adorno tries to describe it, interestingly, in, for example, his essay on subject and object and elsewhere, he starts to use very experiential and, in fact, quite intimate language. He refers to snuggling up to the object. Anschmiegenheit is a term he actually uses here to describe this. And it's remarkable that he has this in mind. He somehow thinks that there's a loving relationship that we could adopt toward our surroundings, which would be the alternative to the typical stance of the bourgeois subject, which is one of domination or mastery. Well, I guess that's probably enough. I'm a little worried about the time because I see it's now 1:01.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for everybody who has joined us for this excellent session on Peter's book, A Precarious Happiness. And I would like to thank Peter first and foremost for joining us and giving us an opportunity to do this session, 24th session of the Questioning the Present, and Jake for joining us as a respondent, and Gordon joining us for a respondent. And unfortunately, Gisèle had to leave early because she had another meeting, and we are very, very grateful to Gisèle as well. And for all of our friends who always regularly attend this session, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll meet you again, one sooner or later.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.